Those of you who know me, or have nothing else to do but watch me, will know that I spend most of my time gallivanting all over the place filming and documenting preserved classes of steam locomotive. And one of the questions I'm often asked is, will you ever cover classes of loco which didn't survive into preservation? Now, I've resisted this for numerous reasons. There's none left, so there's nothing for me to film. Models and train sim versions are sometimes hard to come by and are sometimes not necessarily the most accurate or the most representative of what they were like in service. There's only so many archive films and photographs out there, some of which aren't very good. Most of them are usually under copyright. You can spend ages chasing multiple sources up, and if you're lucky, one of them might get back to you and say, yes, Mr. Eden Green, you may use my badly framed, out of focus, slightly grainy shot of Fakenham West Station for 3 seconds of your 75-minute film. That'll be £200, please. So yeah, for obvious reasons I don't make films about extinct types of locomotives. But then I thought, well, I can't film them, but I could try painting them. There is one snag to this idea, which is that I haven't actually painted anything since I was at school. That was over half a lifetime ago, and even then I wasn't exactly Terence Cuneo. But there are so many videos on YouTube demonstrating various hacks and techniques that make it very tempting for anyone to have a go. You don't have to make it up to the photorealistic standards of the Guild of Railway Artists, and the way I see it is, there's no rule about who can and can't paint. If you apply yourself enough, you might just surprise yourself. But equally, you'll learn what not to do as well. Now, this idea has numerous benefits. I get to try something different, we get to explore numerous art styles, hopefully we get to learn more about steam locomotives. Those who don't like my face don't have to see it, those who don't like steam trains can just watch the painting come together, those who don't like painting can just listen to this as a podcast. We hopefully get to indulge in some traditional pub talk. I get to drink some beer because you can't look. Everybody can win at this. Let's go to work. The first locomotive we're going to have a go at is one of Scotland's biggest missed opportunities, the Highland Railway C-Class 440 Ben Alder. Now, as we start, I'll just point out that yes, I'm painting on paper instead of canvas, and yes, I know that when the paint dries, the paper will curl and crinkle up, which is why I've taped down the edges of the page with masking tape. Of course, it's better to paint on canvas, but a single canvas board can usually cost about as much as a whole sketchbook, so if you make a mistake, it's much cheaper to throw away a page and start again than a canvas board. Contrary to frequent discussion, Ben Alder wasn't the only one of her type. In 1896, Dougal Drummond's little brother Peter became locomotive superintendent of the Highland Railway, and in his 15-year stint he introduced 5 new classes to the railway, the first of which were all named after mountains and hills in the Highland Railway's vicinity. The 20 Bens weren't the biggest locomotives that Drummond designed, but they were his most numerous. They were built between 1898 and 1906 in 3 batches. Ben Alder was the second member of the first batch of 8 engines, which were built by Dubs. The second batch of 9 was built in-house at the Highland Railway's Loch Gorm Works in Inverness. Then in 1903, Dubs merged with 2 other Glaswegian firms, Nielsen Reed, who built the Adams radial tanks, and Sharp Stewart, who built the Jones goods, to become the North British Locomotive Company, not to be confused with the North British Railway. This would go on to build the majority of locomotives for overseas export to the British Empire, but not before they built the last batch of 3 Bens. With a boiler pressure of 175 psi, 6-foot driving wheels, and 18¼ inch by 26 inch cylinders, the 46-ton Bens boasted a tractive effort of 17,891 pounds. They weren't the most powerful engines that Peter Drummond would design, but they were more powerful than the Jones Loch and Strath classes. Fitting really, because mountains always seem to dominate lakes and valleys, even in locomotive form. The mountain that Ben Alder was named after is about 80 miles north of Glasgow as the crow flies, but to get from Glasgow Queen Street to Dalwhinnie, which is the nearest station to the mountain, you have to travel 121 miles by rail, starting on the Caledonian Railway as far as Perth, and then changing for the Highland line to Inverness. The Highland Railway had the most extensive network north of Glasgow, but the Bens, being lighter than the Highland's biggest express engines, tended to work north of Inverness. There was also an enlarged version of 6 members built in 1908 and 09. Their boilers were nearly 9 inches bigger in diameter and the safety valves were mounted separately from the domes. But this was enough to make them about 6¼ tons heavier. They did have an extra 5 psi from the boiler, but that would give them the minimum edge in terms of tractive effort. Now, most of the main Highland trunk routes managed to survive the beaching cuts, including the long spur from Dingwall to Kyle of Lochalsh. There was, however, a part of the Highland network that ran north of Aviemore to Forres. This was opened as part of the Inverness and Perth Junction Railway in 1863, which was amalgamated into the Highland Railway 2 years later. It was bypassed by a more direct line from Aviemore to Inverness in 1898, closed in the 1960s, and then was partly reopened as the Strathspey Railway in 1978. So for the sake of imagination, let's pretend the locomotive is running somewhere on the preserved Strathspey line. Now, I'm painting the locomotive in the same livery that the Jones Goods has worn since she was preserved, which is Stroudley Improved Engine Green, the one that looks more like a yellow ochre. Now, there's been some debate over whether or not this is totally accurate, and many of you may be arguing that I should paint the locomotive a more traditional form of green. But as anyone who's modelled the Highland Railway will tell you, choosing an accurate shade of Highland green is like trimming a rock with paper scissors. It's bloody impossible. That being said, both Dougal and Peter Drummond worked under William Stroudley at some point in their careers. When Dougal began working for the Highland, he was the foreman at Inverness Works under Stroudley's regime, and Peter began his railway career under Stroudley for the London Brighton and South Coast Railway in 1870, which he held down for 5 years. So if Ben Alder hadn't been broken up, maybe someone might have thought wearing this livery at some point would be a tribute to Stroudley. But who knows for sure. Most of the Highland Railway locos remained unaltered until the 1920s, but by then the LMS was keen to standardise replacement components on elderly locos coming up for overhaul. So many of the old Highland engines, including Ben Alder, ended up being fitted with Caledonian Railway boilers. It's not clear when the boiler swap took place, but according to the engine's original drawings, the replacement boiler was from a Caledonian 294 Class 060, itself a Dougal Drummond design. So it seems the family DNA wasn't entirely alienating. According to the same notes, Ben Alder's crank axle and motion had also been changed by 1929, so it has been said that she went into the 1930s as a very different locomotive. Unfortunately, the last person known to have driven a Ben in service, albeit unofficially, passed away in 2020, so we'll never really know for sure. But alas, preservation didn't come for the engine. As one of 10 of the Bens to survive into BR days, Ben Alder was the last of the small Bens to be withdrawn from service as BR number 54398 in 1953. Initially, she was sidelined for preservation because she was the last Highland Railway tender engine in traffic, but after 13 years being marshalled from shed to shed, nobody came forward to save the engine, and she was sent away for scrap in 1966. The really tragic thing is that a minister from the Church of England did come up with the money to save the engine, but he was just days too late. It's not very clear why the engine wasn't prioritised over other Scottish locomotives. Some say nobody could raise the money in time, but then she had been out of traffic for 13 years. There is, however, enough talk to suggest that she was dismissed because of her Caledonian boiler, therefore not making her in original condition. There was apparently some talk of substituting the Cayley boiler with a Drummond M7 boiler if one could be found, but as nice as that sounds, I wonder if that might have been a faff too far at the time. Keep in mind, of course, that in the late 60s, a lot of locomotives were restored without lifting the boiler out of the frames, mainly because a lot of groups couldn't access a crane that was big enough to lift it at that time. So if a boiler swap was achievable, it would likely have to have been done by BR, or maybe have waited a few years when BR had gotten rid of all of its steam cranes. Interestingly, there is a group of people who are raising money to build a working replica of Ben Alder. Now personally, I'm starting to think now may not be quite the right time to introduce more new build locomotive projects, as preservation may face tougher challenges in the coming years, but I'm not going to dismiss this group's intentions for one very important reason. Pre-grouping Scottish stock, not just locomotives but carriages and wagons, is an area that preservation has always lacked, and the existing engines are becoming less and less likely to run further. All of the historic ones attached to the Glasgow Transport Museum haven't run for around 60 years or so, and the museum seems less and less likely to want to run them. The Glasgow and Southwestern tank is suspended above ground level, so that's probably never going to run again. Maud at Bowness is apparently very run down, so she would take a lot of money and work to overhaul. And the two Caledonian locomotives 828 and 419 will also require a lot of work in their next overhauls. So it may be that by the 2030s, existing pre-grouping Scottish steam could be living on borrowed time, if it's not already. It may be that overhauling existing locos could become more arduous than just building new ones. But at the same time, it is only metal, and metal gets replaced on steam engines all the time, so who really knows for sure? Either way, good luck to the group behind the Ben Alder project, and if you would like to learn more about it and maybe contribute towards it, I'll leave a link in the description below. Now there are some impressions of the locomotive painted in pre-grouping colours, but mechanically keeping the engine in her rebuilt form. Now you might think this is blasphemous and say it's an opportunity to build her with a Highland boiler, but it's not unknown to have a modern looking engine in original colours. The Drummond T9 for instance is in the condition she was rebuilt into when she was fitted with superheating, yet in the early 60s she appeared in LSWR pea green. That being said, of course, it's entirely up to the group who were building the engine as to how they build it. So there we are. I hope you enjoyed indulging in this as much as I enjoyed painting it. If you like what you see and you'd like to see more, feel free to like, share, subscribe, discuss, contribute to Steam Locos in Profile on Patreon, and why not have a go yourself? Why not paint your engine?